Okay, we're live for the final talk today at the Staffordshire University Games Christmas Lectures, and we've got Dr. David Murphy. And David is going to be talking about the homebrew scene. The PlayStation homebrew scene. Over to you, David.
Awesome. So first, I want to say a happy holidays, everyone. The talk that I'm going to be giving is part of a much larger project that I started working on when I was doing a postdoc, and I was doing this postdoc in Australia with the amazing Melanie Swalwell, who's also done a book on homebrew in Australia that's out. So check that out if you're interested in homebrew history. Other shout outs to some other awesome folk who've done some great work on homebrew. Yaroslav Svelk, one of my other colleagues. He's done a great history of homebrew in Czechoslovakia, the Czech Republic, and its influence on politics, game development, and the game industry in that region. So I'm very lucky to be part of a very vibrant group of historians and scholars who are interested in understanding homebrew and homebrew histories. So sorry, I'm bowing, but excited to be here. So the presentation that I'm going to give today is going to begin with a brief overview of some of the questions, theories, and methods that I'm applying to my project on the history of the PlayStation Portable homebrew software production scene. And that should help explain why homebrew software production scenes are a very, I would argue, important topic of study, those of us who are interested in game history and game culture. Then I'm going to get into the history of the scene itself and its relationship with the emergence of user-created firmware, and how the emergence of user-created firmware in the scene challenges simple distinctions that historians often make between amateur and professional production. If we want to understand game history and game production and game development, we actually need to understand these scenes. They're really important. And finally, I'm going to describe how a history of the PSP scene provides a useful means of showcasing how research on homebrew software production can provide more geographically aware, inclusive game histories that account for the experiences of bedroom coders, or what I would describe as unofficial developers working all over the world in areas like the Global South. So why study homebrew? Well, there's a variety of reasons in which one would want to study homebrew, aside from just being a bit of a weirdo who's interested in deep cuts into bizarre software. Homebrew software is unofficial software created by users who come together to collaborate, pool resources, and share information. These collaborative modes of production can be thought of really as communities or networks, but I really conceptualize them as scenes. And what's important about homebrew is that there's really a growing body of research that points to the important role that homebrew has played in kickstarting different geographical clusters of studio production that are used to define what is commonly referred to as the computer gaming industry. And a lot of different studio clusters that we refer to as the actual industry were kickstarted by homebrew software production scenes. And a significant amount of innovation in game development occurred and arguably still occurs at the homebrew production scene level, which is why professional developers still like to participate in game jams, why studios and publishers can cluster around particular regions. And I'm proud to say that a lot of the way that we teach game development here at Staffs University also not only borrows from industry, but also can draw inspiration from homebrew scenes. We have some amazing instructors who actually do this with how they teach game development. So we can even look at our curriculum and see that it not only implements industry specific approaches to production, it also has interesting roots in homebrew as well. So the fancy term that we could use is that it's really a key source of vernacular innovation. And it also really challenges our understanding of what is professional and what is amateur. And I can talk more about this if anyone has any other questions as well. So what are other reasons for studying homebrew software production? It's a major driver behind the global spread of game development. So in areas that aren't necessarily recognized as belonging to the game industry at the moment, there are people who still make games in their bedrooms, basements, what have it, in different domestic settings. So homebrew is a really important means of not only spreading games, but also game production around the world. Put another way, homebrew production scenes are sites of vernacular innovation, helping to drive the global expansion of game development beyond what is currently recognized as the formal industry. But unfortunately, a lot of innovations that actually occur in homebrew production scenes are missing from industrial narratives that dominate gaming histories, resulting in a significant gap between what one of my really interesting colleagues, Brendan Keogh, will often describe as formal and informal production economies and cultures. And investigating this gap and its relationship with how game development is changing on both a formal industrial and an informal homebrew level is a key objective of my PSP homebrew project. So, why am I interested in homebrew created for the PSP, right? There's been lots of homebrew software production scenes for those of you who may be familiar with homebrew. What makes homebrew that's created for the PSP special? Well, every homebrew scene is unique. Most scenes exist on what I would describe as a pre-professional, kind of post-industrial spectrum, emerging in specific regions where an industry has yet to develop, or around a specific platform that an industry has already abandoned. So some of you may know that there's still a lot of fans of game consoles that are no longer being supported commercially that will still create homebrew for those consoles. If you're interested in NES homebrew, for example. Now, the homebrew scene that surrounds the PSP is actually quite different, though. It's different than homebrew scenes that existed before industry, and it's different than fans trying to keep consoles alive. Because the homebrew scene that surrounded the PSP was one of the largest and actually the most influential homebrew scenes that emerged in the early aughts, which was a very important point of transition for gaming industries and gaming development. So that's the first reason. Second reason why homebrew for the PSP is important is that members of the homebrew PSP homebrew game development scene or software development scene developed a variety of applications that really pushed the boundaries of mobile computing prior to the ubiquitous spread of smartphones. So you see a lot of really fascinating homebrew made for the PSP that are really prototypical apps, which later become popularized by way of smartphones. And third, the PSP homebrew software development scene emerged within months of the platform's release after a method of creating and running homebrew without the need of hardware modifications was discovered. So some of the cool tricks that the scene developed for running homebrew are quite significant because a lot of homebrew software production scenes do require a hardware, I should say, modifications that need to be made in order for you to get homebrew running up on the console. But the PSP scene, no hardware software was needed. And that really was a real gateway that drew a lot of people to the scene. And finally, the PSP scene really developed a plethora of tactics that were used to downgrade, circumvent, and eventually actually replace the PSP's firmware when Sony's firmware updates prevented homebrew from running, including tactics which required coding and engineering knowledge that users and amateurs are just not supposed to have. And this is particularly related to what I think is one of the most significant, interesting aspects about the scene, which is the creation of scene-driven user-created firmware. Now, there's a tendency to think of homebrew software production as a form of amateur software production, but I would like to insist that the modes of production that occurred in the PSP scene are better understood as being paraprofessional. And I would go as far as insisting, if there's any PSP collectors out there, that for all intents and purposes, the PSP was forked and really split between official and unofficial production cultures that really proceeded to coexist, kind of compete with each other, and even some cases actually mutually inform each other. Now, launched in Japan in the winter of 2004, the PSP was actually the most powerful and affordable mobile multimedia device released as a gaming platform at the beginning of the 21st century. Its 333 megahertz CPU can render detailed three-dimensional environments. Its 4.3-inch LCD screen features a 480 by 272 pixel display, and it came with a 2.4 gigahertz wireless internet connection when the Xbox and PS2 were actually still on broadband. This is actually one of the first gaming platforms that we see that has a wireless internet connection attached to it, and that would be really significant for what the scene would do with it, and also how it would be hacked and cracked. And a lot of people will discuss the PSP as being a kind of a precursor, actually, to the Nintendo Wii U, the Switch, and now the Steam Deck. This is one of the first mobile gaming platforms that really tried to bring a 3D gaming experience to the mobile market. But that's not all, or not the only reason why I would argue that it's historically important, specifically when we start thinking about the scene. Now, for some reason, though, while this platform was notable for having a wireless internet connection, Sony forgot to include an internet browser in the first iteration of the firmware. So while the platform had a wireless connection, there wasn't really any software that took advantage of it. And this latent wireless capability would be a really important motivator for the scene, and a factor, as I mentioned previously, that led to the PSP being cracked. Now, the initial hacking of the PSP was accomplished by a collective known as the Saturn Expedition Committee. And it's the work of a Japanese unofficial developer known as NEM was quite important here. And it was communicated by the release of a simple program. Those of you who are familiar with programming and Homebrew, Hello World is often a program that gets released to mark the release of Homebrew on a platform, or it's the first program that you might want to create for a platform. And that's what really marked the beginning of the scene, when a version of Hello World running on a PSP that was actually created using the PS2 dev toolchain, which was a Homebrew toolchain used to make Homebrew for the PS2. So Hello World PSP, when it was released, it actually only worked on PSPs with firmware version 1.0, or the initial stock of units that were shipped when the system was originally launched in Japan. And people were actually scrambling through the internet to try to get their hands on a version of the PSP that had this firmware when they saw that you could actually make Homebrew for it. Now, PSPs shipped to North America, Brazil, and Europe actually came with firmware 1.5. But over a month after Hello World showed what was possible, a new method of loading Homebrew that ran on firmware 1.5 was discovered. Now, this method for running Homebrew on firmware 1.5 was called the Swaploid by the scene, and it actually involved swapping memory sticks while the file was in the process of loading, and effectively tricking the PSP into thinking that a program had permission to run off of the memory stick. And if you swap the memory stick super quick, you could actually do this and get Homebrew to load. Far from user-friendly, of course, it was very difficult to use, but it actually caught the attention of Slashdot. Some of you may be familiar with Slashdot, but it was a quite well-known tech blog that filtered through open source software production scenes at this particular point of time. So when Slashdot basically had a post that reported on this method being developed, a lot of hackers, crackers, you name it, were drawn to the PSP, and a variety of them started to experiment with coming up with different methods of loading Homebrew. And amongst the various teams that were working on the PSP at this point in time, a team called PSP Dev, which was a Spanish team that actually created Swaploid, or is responsible for Swaploid. Some people do dispute that, I should point out. They were also connected, and in some cases also the origins of this exploit are disputed, but they became known or were connected with the release of the latest exploit that really streamlined the Swaploid, and that was called the K-exploit. So the K-exploit tool was released on June 22nd, 2005, and its impact on the scene was really dramatic. The team that created it had written a program that could actually load Homebrew on firmware 1.5 without the aid of any kind of hardware modifications. And due to the amount of units that were shipped prior to the PSP's North American release, units with firmware 1.5 were actually quite widely available in a variety of different regions. So for a brief window of time, if you lived in a region where the PSP was released, you could literally just go to a store, buy it, download the K-exploit, and start creating Homebrew that your own PSP applications would run out of, or from a PSP taken right out of a retail store. Pretty amazing and somewhat unprecedented for a lot of Homebrew scenes at the time. Now, obviously, Sony was not happy about this, but the only way that they could prevent Homebrew from running was to get users to update their firmware. And updates actually had to be installed voluntarily at this time. You actually had to convince people to update their firmware. We're yet at a point in time in which firmware is being updated automatically, and you're required to update firmware automatically. And I would argue that Sony's shift towards requiring people to update their firmware actually, in many cases, is directly related to this case. So, following the release of Hello World and the K-Exploit tool, a lot of homebrew is being made for the PSP. And a lot of the homebrew made for the firmware and made for the PSP at this point in time really consists of a lot of remakes of classic games, a lot of emulations that emulated classic video game platforms. Emulators start to become a huge push within the PSP scene at this point in time for a variety of reasons, namely that the PSP became this amazing portable retro gaming machine if you hacked it, and you could fill it not only with old games, but even in some cases PS1 games using some of the tools that were out there. So the PSP was an amazing portable system that you could use to play NES games, Super Nintendo games, Genesis games, microcomputer games, you name it. And a lot of the emulators that were created for the PSP were excellent. And some of them are actually the good ones that are still used actually would take advantage of the PSP's unique design, and you could just tap on the triggers in order to reload save states and things like that. They're phenomenal. So following the release of Hello World, as I said before, you had a lot of early homebrew stuff, a lot of game stuff, but then you started getting a variety of different hackers that were interested in actually pushing the mobile computing capabilities of the PSP, which had absolutely nothing to do with games. And they were really interested in using their PSPs as prototypical smartphones. So as the scene grew, a multitude of experimental applications appeared that really pushed the boundaries of mobile computing. The IR shell, it's called the IR shell, transformed the PSP into a pre-cloud data storage network that loaded homebrew applications stored on a home computer so you could network it. The Away from Keyboard Instant Messenger, which is the AFKIM, provided access to different social media platforms, coupling Yahoo, ICQ, MSN messaging, if anyone remembers those in the audience, services into a single application. So you could use your PSP to talk to your friends on ICQ in the early aughts. PSPDK was a homebrew development suite filled with tools and utilities for creating PSP software. So there's a lot of really interesting examples of people releasing suites that are made to help other people create homebrew for the PSP. And there's a variety of different music applications as well. PSP Kick was a portable drum machine that loaded samples, so you could turn your PSP into a drum machine and use it in order to make electronic music on the go. And this is just some examples of the notable homebrew that's made for the PSP at the height of interest in the scene. Now, by October of 2005, articles on the scene's accomplishments began to appear in popular newspapers and magazines. The Guardian covered it. The PSP was the must-have gadget of the year, according to Popular Science, due to the quality and really the popularity of homebrew that was being created. People were buying the PSP at this particular point in time, really to hack it and do cool things with it. And it's really fascinating that the PSP was being used for those reasons. And a major reason for this is it was basically just a super cheap mobile computer that you could do a lot of super cool things with if you had the know-how. Now, once the media started reporting on the PSP homebrew scene, it really puts Sony into a difficult position. They could not force updates onto users, right? We don't have forced updates at this point. Directly because the updates had to be installed manually and voluntarily, but they could require users who purchase new games to get their firmware or to update their firmware to get new games to run. Now, homebrew users were obviously not happy with this development. A lot of people were running some pretty cool homebrew on the system, but if you wanted to buy a new retail game, you had to basically update the firmware and disable your homebrew from running. So many really dug in their heels. And for this reason, Sony developed a new complementary strategy. The PSP came with Wi-Fi connectivity, but it did not come with a web browser, which was a fact that advocates for Homebrew would often actually cite as a reason for why Homebrew for the PSP was innovative and important. Now, Homebrew browsers did exist, but they're actually modified versions of a browser that someone found in Wipeout Pure. So if anyone has Wipeout Pure for the PSP on their shelves, there was a web browser that was found in that PSP users were actually using to surf the web when Sony hadn't come out with a web browser previously. But the problem with the browser that was found in Wipeout Pure was that it did not have any kind of up-to-date support for Flash plugins. So Sony basically sensed an opportunity. They included a new web browser in firmware 2.0 that finally supported Flash. And this new browser was actually quite a bit of a blow to the scene, because it was a significant upgrade that plenty of users actually wanted to install. Now, this tension really kickstarted what I would refer to as a metagame that unofficial Homebrew PSP developers, I would say, played with, alongside, and against Sony as new versions of the PSP firmware were released, and then members of the scene would subsequently try to come up with hacks. Now, at this point in time, the scene became really less interested in playing games that were released by Sony and actually more interested in playing games with Sony. And I would argue that both the scene and Sony learned a lot from this kind of back and forth between the official and unofficial developers. Sony learned in order how to really improve its cybersecurity, and developers in the scene learned how to make they learned about security exploits, and they also learned how to make some pretty cool software for the platform. Now, with the release of firmware 2.0, incompatibilities actually began to have a chilling effect on the scene. A lot of people heard about the scene, they wanted to get involved in it, but if they bought a new PSP, they were stuck with updated firmware that could not load Homebrew, and users with firmware 1.5 were very much tempted to update. And part of the reason why users with firmware 1.5 were tempted to update is because Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories was released for the PSP, and this was a pretty big release for a mobile at the time. And a lot of users wanted to update their firmware really for the purposes of playing it. Some sacrificed their Homebrew just in order to do this. Now, the scene responded to Sony's firmware updates by actually developing a variety of Homebrew loading options that you could use to also play Grand Theft Auto, Liberty City Stories, and load Homebrew. They used downgraders that were used to reload firmware 1.5. Loaders were used to run a variety of firmware on PSPs that had been updated. Now, one of the most popular loaders was actually created by a team known as Team Noobs. And this one actually took advantage of a bug that was found in GTA Liberty City Stories, which was used to load Homebrew through the save game menu. So they actually figured out how you could actually use a bug in the save game menu of Grand Theft Auto Liberty City Stories to keep loading Homebrew if you updated your PSP to firmware 2.0 just to run this game. Now, downgraders and e-loaders really met the needs of some people in the scene, but they were actually really hard to run and really hard to set up. Loaders only supported a selection of existing applications. They had to be updated after each new firmware release. This was by no means even close to user-friendly, which often restricted the unofficial developer pool to users with firmware 1.5. Fortunately, there was one application which attempted to overcome the incompatibility problem that would open up a whole new direction for the scene and leave a legacy that would outshine, that can actually continues to exist within the scene and would create a popular mythology describing its creator. Now, the creator of this unique PSP firmware did not create the dev hook means of uploading Homebrew, but it was influenced by it, right? Now, DevHook was created by a Spanish hacker named Booster, and it was technically advanced when compared to other Homebrew loading options that were available. Instead of installing a firmware update or a previous firmware version, DevHook was actually emulating firmware 2.5. It was not easy to use, so a lot of people didn't end up using it, didn't have a large following. A lot of people don't even really know who Booster is. But Booster actually shared the source code with a new developer who went by the name of Dark Alex. who stumbled across the scene in 2006. Now, Dark Alex on July 15th, 2006, released a proof of concept program, which demonstrated that in order to get around the kind of back and forth with Sony that the scene was going through with every firmware update, that a user-created firmware was feasible and could be made. Basically, the scene could fork the platform, create its own firmware, then continue updating that firmware and not have to worry about cracking every firmware iteration that Sony had created. And over the next 3 months, Dark Alex released a homebrew loader, an updated version of DevHook before unveiling his masterpiece, a fully functioning custom firmware for use on the PSP. So basically, the emergence, I should say, of user-created firmware was a major event that revitalized the PSP homebrew software production scene. Finally, homebrew could be loaded seamlessly alongside official applications, which not only lifted the chill on development, but also permitted purchasers of new PSPs to commence with the creation of homebrew. When this came out, you could buy a new PSP, you could put Dark Alex's fully functioning firmware on it. You could run PSP games, you could run emulators, you could run apps. You could basically turn your PSP into an extremely powerful mobile computer and do all kinds of weird, fun, and amazing things with it. The amazing thing about Dark Alex's firmware was that it was also remarkably stable as well. It was not very buggy, pretty solid. There are still people running PSPs with this firmware or versions of firmware based on this firmware to this day. And you can still find a firmware, either this firmware or versions based off of this firmware out in the wild if you go try to buy a PSP that's used online. So needless to say, Dark Alex became a bit of a legend, a pretty huge legend in the scene. But we actually know very little about who Dark Alex is. Alex is known to have been working out of Mexico before really kind of disappearing from the scene and the internet in general without much of a trace. Was interviewed by The Guardian, actually, but we never learned of Dark Alex's real name. Now, there's a lot more that I could say about the history of the scene, but for the sake of time, I'm going to stop here with this little tease with respect to the story of Dark Alex. If any of you are familiar with the scene, I mean, there's a variety of other things that occur after the custom firmware is released. There's a hacking supergroup. There's a magic memory stick. There's leaks that come from Sony. Sony starts studying the scene at one particular point in time. So this is really the beginning of a really fascinating story and a very fascinating history that I'm developing as part of a broader book-length project. But for the sake of today, I'm actually going to stop here with the story of Dark Alex. But what I wanted to basically point out is that in closing, it's important to state that there's actually not a lot of well-known developers from Mexico that exist within our industrial game histories, right? So this project really highlights the important insight that scene histories of homebrew software production can provide with respect to developing more geographically aware, diverse game histories. But also calling attention to the impact that different developers that are often missing from not only industrial game histories, but developers working in regions that are often not even accounted for the broader history of technological innovation in general. We don't often think about Mexico as being an area where we see a lot of development, not only within the game industry, but also with tech in general. But Mexico is the area that Dark Alex was working at when he became a legend in the PSP scene for developing amazing user-created firmware. So, and that'll be about it. You're my time anyway. So if anyone has any questions or comments, or if you know anything about the PSP scene, you knew it, or anything like that, feel free to ask.
Thank you very much, David. We've got a couple of questions coming. For people who would like to get involved in the homebrew scene, what skills are required?
Oh, that's a great example. So if you're interested in making homebrew for the PSP, basically coding. So there's a variety of different applications out there. But like if you you don't, from my understanding, need any specific hardware understanding in order to get some code up on the PSP. Part of the reason why the scene became so popular was that for people who had knowledge of C+ and the C programming languages, it was pretty easy actually to create homebrew for the PSP. So it was actually strongly driven by computer science students. Tons of computer science students created their own apps, their own applications for the PSP when it was out there. And it gave those students an opportunity to actually work on a real industrial platform at a time when that was extremely rare in the early aughts. So if you got a little bit of coding knowledge, it's a remarkably amazing platform developed for to this day.
Cool.
But yeah.
Okay, brilliant. And one last question before we leave it for the day. Let me just get it up. Is the homebrew scene, that's a badly worded question, is the homebrew scene typically on older devices? And if so, is it still an evolving community?
Yeah, it's still a community. So there's still people who are making homebrew for the PSP to this day. And there's some pretty wild stuff that's being made. Recent iterations of firmware based off Dark Alex's firmware have been released like within the last decade. So it's still an evolving community. It's gone from being the scene that was actually big when the device was popular to a scene that's now still making work for this device. But when you're saying is it typically on older devices, I would say it's a mixture. But a lot of homebrew scenes to this day are definitely on older devices. So people who are still making games for things like the Atari, people who are still making games for the NES, people making games for the SNES, the Genesis, you name it. Most scenes are still dedicated to older devices, and the PSP has become that kind of a scene. But yes, there are. It's rare for being the one scene that actually gave people who wanted to make software on a pretty cutting edge platform that opportunity at that time.
Cool. Brilliant. Thank you, David. Right, that's all we've got time for today, folks. And that's the last talk for today. But if you join us tomorrow, Wednesday, the 14th of December at 1 p.m, we've got another 4 amazing talks from people at Staffs and the games industry. Okay. Look forward to seeing you. And thanks, David.
Thank you. And I should also say this is not a photo of Dark Alex. No photo exists. This is a photo a fan thinks Dark Alex may have looked like.
Brilliant.
So he's that big of a legend. People
Well, it's quite a flattering photo.
It's a model. It's totally not. Yeah.
All right, brilliant. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye. Bye.